On a ledge overlooking the sea, Ushijima performs the samurai ritual of harakiri.
From the horrors of war to unimaginable acts of cruelty, history holds dark secrets that are rarely discussed. In today's video, I'll dive into the chilling stories of Japanese cannibals whose atrocities were even more shocking than the brutal actions of the Nazis.
An American B-29 aircraft dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima.
The Emperor's naked army marches on. Kenzo Okuzaki, a World War II vet, turned wild card and just couldn't let go of the past. He was featured in the 1988 eye-opener, The Emperor's Naked Army Marches On, and this guy had quite the rap sheet, including a decade behind bars for a serious altercation in the 50s. Back in '69, he pulled a stunt straight out of a movie, launching pachinko pinballs at Emperor Hirohito right outside the Imperial Palace, all to spotlight the Emperor's shady war moves. Though his wild accusations got tossed, it still sparked a rare jab at Japan's dark war secrets. Fast forward to the 80s, and there was Okuzaki, an unstoppable force, chasing down ghosts of his old squad from the 36th Independent Engineering Regiment. His mission? To dig up what really went down with his crew in New Guinea during the clash. His method? Hardcore confrontations with ex-officers that could chill your spine, uncovering some twisted survival tales. Despite his efforts, the full story of his buddies' grim experiences remained murky. The documentary wrapped with Okuzaki back in the slammer after a heated clash nearly turned deadly. A grisly discovery in Papua New Guinea. Historian Toshiyuki Tanaka began uncovering some shocking truths about wartime atrocities, things that sounded like they were straight out of a horror movie, except they were all too real. Tanaka wasn't an old-timer. Born after Japan's defeat, he was determined to educate the younger generation about these dark chapters. In 1992, he made a groundbreaking revelation, exposing over 100 incidents where Japanese troops in Papua New Guinea went savage, not out of desperation, but driven by some twisted sense of triumph. Tanaka didn't hold back, stating, "This wasn't just a few rogue soldiers. We're talking entire squads turning barbaric, and not always because they were starving." And to add to the horror, a Pakistani corporal recounted how one unfortunate person was chosen each day for 100 days to meet a grisly fate. The sickening story of the Suzuki unit. Dr. Hajime Ainoda and his Suzuki unit weren't just scraping by on scraps in the Bukidnon region, Philippines, back in 1945. Sure, they started off with enough rations and even boosted their supplies by swiping what they could from local villages. But when diseases started knocking them down one by one, these guys took a dark turn into cannibalism. Ainoda tried to justify their grim diet, claiming it was all about keeping his squad on their feet, saying they only resorted to consuming those who had already passed from sickness or in the chaos of conflict. But whispers started, suggesting that this wasn't just about survival. Testimonies like that of soldier Rikimi Yamamoto blew the lid off, revealing that patrols were out there, rounding up, not just finding, their gruesome groceries, sometimes even targeting locals. When the authorities finally caught up with them, the evidence was chilling. Ainoda and his 9 men faced the ultimate price: the choice to become a cannibal. Some of these guys turned to cannibalism during the war, not out of necessity, but because they just refused to give up. But get this, not everyone went down that dark path. Take Hiru Onoda, for example, who toughed it out in the Philippine jungle from 1944 to 1974. This guy was all about boiled bananas, coconuts, and the occasional snagged rice or cow. And then there was another soldier, this one bolting from his unhinged unit, only to get snagged by the Allies. Now, not all soldiers were about that horror show. The question loomed, why did this even start among Japanese troops? The answer might just chill you to the bone. One young soldier, during a trial, confessed to unthinkable acts driven by sheer desperation and deep-seated rage. The guy described his actions as something straight out of a nightmare, blaming the brutal war for turning him into a monster. And speaking of monsters, Major Matoba Sweo dropped a real talk shocker when he said, "I was a madman due to the war," using that as his excuse for crossing into dark territories that even horror flicks shy away from. Bataan Death March. Imperial Japan really gave the Nazis a run for their money with their wickedness, and the Bataan Death March? That's a whole different level of nasty. So, here's the lowdown. In 1942, the Japanese snagged control over the Philippines' Bataan area, and let's just say they weren't playing nice. They rounded up about 75,000 POWs and decided a little forced march into the wilderness was in order. This was no stroll in the park, though. We're talking about a grueling 65-kilometer trek to what they call detention camps. The Japanese weren't just about relocating these guys. Nah, they had a darker game plan. Imagine reading this in a history book. The aim is to exterminate them without leaving traces. It's easier that way. Germ warfare. During World War II, the Japanese military was unleashing infectious warfare on the poor souls in China, thanks to General Shiro Ishii and his creepy crew. Right under everyone's noses, Ishii sets up this so-called hospital near Harbin, but guess what? It's actually the infamous Unit 731, where this guy is practically turning prisoners into lab rats, experimenting with everything deadly from cholera to the plague. And it's not just small time. We're talking about causing up to 300,000 innocents to meet grim fates. After all that horror, the US swoops in, doesn't slap cuffs on him, but offers him and his pals a free pass in exchange for the lowdown on their sick experiments. The Alexandra Hospital Massacre. In 1942, under General Tomoyuki Yamashita, Imperial Japan was on a rampage. They stormed into Singapore and took over Alexandra Hospital like it was some kind of wild raid. They didn't just barge in, they wreaked havoc. Patients, staff, everyone felt their fury. And if that wasn't enough, they dragged out 100 souls from the hospital, cooped them up in sweltering barns overnight, and the next day, chaos was unleashed as lives were ended randomly. Fast forward to the post-war trials, and what did they get? A hot mess. Despite the piles of evidence, pinning down the culprits and serving justice was like finding a needle in a haystack. Operation M, 1941. Operation M, hitting the ground running in 1941, was a wild ride from the get-go. This was when the Japanese decided to crash the British party in Malaya, eyeing all that rubber and tin. They kicked off this whole shindig just hours before stirring up trouble at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese weren't messing around. They had been plotting this since October 1940, stacking up over 200 tanks and nearly 800 aircraft to make sure they had the upper hand. Their first big splash was at Kota Baru, Malaya, at the witching hour of 1:45 a.m. on December 8, 1941. They didn't just stop there, they also landed in Thailand at Patani and Singora, ready to strut down both coasts of the Malay Peninsula. These guys were clever, using bicycle infantry to zip through the jungle and sneak past British lines. Despite the Allies busting up over 100 bridges in a frantic retreat, the Japanese just kept rolling. By January 31st, 1942, they had pushed the last of the British Commonwealth troops all the way back to Singapore, wrapping up their blitzkrieg tour of Malaya. The use of bicycles in Malaya, 1941. In 1941, during the Japanese invasion of Malaya, the Japanese troops pulled off something wild. They called it the Bicycle Blitzkrieg. These guys, led by General Tomoyuki Yamashita, ditched the usual clunkers like tanks and horses for bicycles. That's right, bicycles. Zipping through dense jungles and narrow roads, They caught the British and Commonwealth forces totally off guard. These clever troops weren't just peddling for fun, they were strategic about it. Bikes let them haul more supplies and cover up to 70 miles a day, and get this, when their tires gave out, they didn't just give up. No, they kept rolling on those metal rims, making a racket that freaked out the British, making them think tanks were coming. With fewer than 50 casualties in key clashes like Jitra, this bicycle blitzkrieg was a game-changer that led to a stunning victory in Malaya. Operation Z. Operation Z was this totally off-the-rails Japanese naval plan hatched in 1944 by Admiral Minachi Koga. They thought they'd trap the US Navy near the Marianas for a massive showdown to flip the script in the Pacific. The plan? Roll out over 1,000 planes from the Marianas, Caroline Islands, and New Guinea, plus line up 9 aircraft carriers. But their resources were basically in the pits, and the US Navy was just getting stronger. Then, a shocker struck. Koga's plane crashed into the sea near the Philippines on March 31, 1944. The plot thickens when Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudomi survives but gets snagged by Filipino guerrillas with the top-secret docs. Those papers ended up with the Allies, leading to the infamous Great Marianas Turkey Shoot at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where the US handed Japan one of its most crushing defeats. The use of human-guided torpedoes. The Japanese cooked up a crazy tactic called kaitin during World War II. Think kamikaze, but underwater. These weren't just any torpedoes, they were human-guided machines of mayhem. Pilots, young dudes aged between 17 and 28, were literally sealed inside these modified long-lance torpedoes, ready to steer them right into Allied ships. The whole thing kicked off around 1943, with the first kaitin hitting the water by early 1944. The idea, if losses kept piling up, why not try something utterly mind-boggling? These pilots, strapped in their metal coffins, could tweak their course using a periscope and some basic controls. But bailing out, forget about it. This was a one-way ticket. Despite their intense training on Ozushima Island, the success rate was pretty grim. Over 100 kaitins launched, but they only managed to take down a handful of ships. Over 900 Japanese submariners and crew also went down with this wild plan, showing just how extreme things got. The Japanese Code of Silence. The Japanese no-surrender code was like the ultimate dare from the samurai days. Seriously, these guys were all about honor and loyalty, fighting to the bitter end rather than spilling the beans to the enemy. It's wild, right? They'd rather go out in a blaze of glory, thinking it's top honor to die for the emperor than to dishonor themselves by surrendering. Despite their hardcore attitude, some of these soldiers got snagged by the Allies. Most clammed up, sticking to the code like glue. But a few, thanks to the pressure or maybe injuries, ended up coughing up bits of gold info. The US had this ace up their sleeve, the Nisei interpreters, who were Japanese Americans pulling out intel like magicians. This code of silence made the battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa some of the most brutally stubborn fights. These guys took fight to the last man to a whole new level, choosing suicide over capture. The Tokyo Express. The Tokyo Express was Japan's wild ride of desperation during World War II. Officially dubbed the Rat Transportation, this crazy train of high-speed naval missions was all about keeping their troops juiced up on Guadalcanal during the heated Solomon Islands scrap from 1942 to early 1943. Led by the gutsy Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka, the Imperial Japanese Navy played a deadly game of cat and mouse under the moonlight. They sent their destroyers, packed with supplies and reinforcements, tearing through the Slot, a treacherous channel in the Solomon Islands, trying to dodge the Allies' prying eyes and airstrikes from Henderson Field. Tanaka's sneaky maneuvers often slipped right past the US Navy's traps, sparking major showdowns, yet this high-stakes game cost them big time. They lost a bunch of destroyers they couldn't replace, knocking the wind out of their naval power later in the war. The Tokyo Express was a bold move, but by early 1943, when the Japanese had to bail, it marked the start of their nosedive in the Pacific Showdown. The Burma Railway. The Burma Railway, infamously tagged the Death Railway, screams nightmare fuel louder than anything you've heard. Built between 1942 and 1943 during World War II, this stretch of horror was the Japanese Army's project for storming into Burma and eventually pushing into British India. Over 250,000 Southeast Asian civilians and about 60,000 tough Allied POWs, including Brits, Aussies, Dutch, and Americans, were forced into building this track, and the conditions were beyond rough. These men were pushed into brutal 18-hour shifts, cutting through soggy jungles and chipping away at dangerous rocks, all under the watchful and unforgiving eyes of the Japanese and their Korean enforcers. Starvation, disease, and a merciless environment, they faced it all. Tragically, 90,000 civilians and 12,000 Allied troops never made it home. By the time the railway was finished in October 1943, it was more trouble than it was worth, quickly becoming a target for Allied forces. The Imphal and Kohima campaigns. The Imphal and Kohima campaigns of 1944 were pivotal and brutal battles involving the Japanese army during World War II. These battles, from March to July 1944, were part of Japan's Operation Yugo, aimed at invading India and severing British and Allied forces from the region. The Japanese 15th Army, led by Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi, sought to capture Imphal and Kohima in northeastern India, aiming to disrupt Allied supply lines and incite Indian nationalists against British rule. The campaign began with intense assaults on Imphal, where Japanese forces surrounded the town and cut off supply routes. Meanwhile, 15,000 Japanese troops besieged Kohima, a critical hilltop town for Imphal's defense. The Battle of Kohima is notable for close-quarter combat, with fighting as close as the width of a tennis court. Despite being outnumbered, British Indian forces held until reinforcements arrived on April 18, 1944, marking a turning point. By June, the Allies had driven the Japanese back into Burma. The Imphal and Kohima campaigns inflicted over 50,000 casualties on the Japanese, halting their advance into India. These battles, often called the Stalingrad of the East, marked the beginning of Japan's retreat from Southeast Asia and led to the Allied reconquest of Burma. Japan's radio silence strategy. During World War II, Japanese military leaders pulled off one of the slickest tricks with their radio silence strategy. It was the big lead-up to the Pearl Harbor attack. The Imperial Japanese Navy went ghost mode, total radio blackout. Not a peep over the airwaves from their key ships, that powerful fleet with 6 aircraft carriers sneaking towards Hawaii. These crafty operators weren't just chilling, they had their radio guys back home sending fake signals, making it look like the carriers were just hanging out in Japanese waters. US intelligence got duped big time, thinking these massive floating fortresses were still docked and not on their way to throw down a surprise party in the Pacific. This whole ghost act wasn't new. They'd been perfecting this game of silent cat and mouse since the Russo-Japanese War. Cut to Pearl Harbor, and bam! The US Navy didn't know what hit them, marking one of the sneakiest and most game-changing moves early in the war. The defense of Okinawa. The defense of Okinawa back in 1945 was like the ultimate standoff in World War II. This battle turned into the longest and most intense slugfest of the Pacific War. Dubbed Operation Iceberg, it was basically Japan's last stand before the big guys planned to storm the Japanese home turf. Commanded by General Mitsuru Ushijima, the Japanese 32nd Army wasn't about that frontal assault life. Instead, they hunkered down, with about 77,000 troops fortified up the wazoo across southern Okinawa, especially around the Shuri Line. Their game plan? Bleed the American forces dry, making them slog it out for every inch. The Japanese went all out, but in the end, they were up against too much firepower. The fallout? Massive. Around 100,000 Japanese troops didn't make it out. The Americans faced over 12,000 losses themselves. The Yamato battleship. In December 1941, the Yamato wasn't just a ship, it was a monster on the water and the crown jewel of the Imperial Japanese Navy. This behemoth is armed to the teeth with 9 massive cannons, each slinging shells over 25 miles away. Japan's big bet was to dominate the seas during World War II. Yamato started off flashy, but let me tell you, despite packing serious heat, she barely got to show off because the game was changing. Aircraft carriers were the new kings. Her moment to shine? The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, where she finally let loose and helped take down some American ships. Still, it wasn't enough to dodge a massive L for Japan. Fast forward to 1945, things were looking grim for Japan, and Yamato got one last mission. Basically, a one-way ticket. No backup in the skies and not enough fuel to get back home. Over 300 American planes swarmed, and it was game over. She went down, taking most of her crew with her. The defense of Peleliu. The defense of Peleliu in 1944 was like watching a hardcore survival game. Those Japanese forces, under the iron-willed Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, totally flipped the script. No more wild banzai rushes for them. Instead, they hunkered down in a maze of over 500 caves and bunkers. They're holed up in those natural fortresses in the Umurbrogul Mountains, now famously dubbed Bloody Nose Ridge, turning the place into an absolute grinder. From September 15 to November 27, 1944, as part of the American island hopping campaign, the scene was set for one of the gnarliest showdowns. Nakagawa's 11,000 troops were not just sitting ducks, they were a stealthy force, popping out for surprise hits and then vanishing again, all while the Marines, led by the legendary Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, were getting hammered by relentless mortar and firearm barrages. Despite the Allies' intense bombardment before storming in, those Japanese defenses were like, "Is that all you got?" In the end, with his crew dwindling and all looking grim, Nakagawa chose the samurai exit with a ritual suicide on November 24th, marking the brutal close of the battle. The Mitsubishi A6M0. The Mitsubishi A6M0 was the real MVP of World War II skies, a sleek beast cooked up by the genius Jiro Horikoshi in 1939. This baby wasn't just another fighter jet, it was a game changer. Lightweight and nimble like you wouldn't believe, boasting an insane range of over 1,600 miles. What gave the Zero its swagger? A combo of extra super duralumin and savvy engineering that made it zip through the air with the greatest of ease, outclassing almost any Allied plane at the start. But here's the twist. Despite its early buzz, the Zero was skating on thin ice with no armor or self-sealing tanks, making it a sitting duck for the sharpshooters. Then came the plot twist in 1942 when the Allies snagged a mostly intact Zero and got the inside scoop on its Achilles heel, turning the tide with beasts like the Grumman F-6F Hellcat. By 1944, the Zero was still iconic but had lost its top dog status, yet it remained a legend of Japan's air ace lineup. Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night. Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night, also known as Operation PX, was a chilling plan devised by the Japanese military in 1945. Led by the infamous Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii of Unit 731, it aimed to strike the US where it would hurt the most. Their weapon of choice? Plague-infected fleas. Here's the scoop. 5 I-400 class submarines, each packing 3 Aichi M6A Siran aircraft, were set to cruise off Southern California's coast. The mission? To unleash these plague bombs over bustling cities like San Diego, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. The whole operation was designed as a one-way ticket for the crew involved. But plot twist, the big bosses got cold feet. The plan could have spiraled into a full-blown biological nightmare. Thanks to Japan's surrender in August 1945, after those game-changing atomic bombings, the plan got shelved, staying under wraps for decades. That's all for today's video. So, what do you think? Which part of this disturbing history shocked you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more eye-opening content in the future.